Let's examine the different models of federalism that we've had through the history of the United States. The model of dual federalism basically ran from the beginning of the country until the election of 1932 following the Great Depression, or right in the midst of the Great Depression to be better stated. And it looked at both the national and state governments being of equal power, having two separate respective spheres that basically it's separate and distinct, kind of like a layered cake, if you will. A layered cake model is really kind of neat because you have layers that never go through, but occasionally they overlap. This is based on the idea of the compact theory. It claims that the nation was formed through a compact agreed upon by all the states, and that the national government is consequently a creation of the states. This is an argument that was made by then Vice President John C. Calhoun, that the states could determine if the national government had overstepped their boundaries because of this compact, this concept of nullification, where a state can nullify a law they did not agree with. This is a term that Jefferson and Madison had also talked about in the late 1790s with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, as far as what we have today, what about the interpretation of the 14th Amendment and how much it became? There was a national law, but left to the states to be enforced. So up until 1865, it was a matter of state versus national being powerful. After 1865 to 1932, it's a matter of the states doing the federal job, but the federal government did not want this to be actually enforced unless the states did it, and they took a different event. The biggest catastrophic event was the Depression, which caused us to have to rethink how government looks. The second model we're going to look at is cooperative federalism, which runs basically from the New Deal and FDR into Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, that looks at the linkages and joint arrangements amongst the three levels of government, which are basically the federal, the state, and the local. And it was, in a way, it was to take the catastrophic effects of the Great Depression and adjust them. It moves it to the federal government taking more of a burden on, as opposed to the states and private charities. And what we get out of this is the Social Security Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a much greater role of the federal government. So before 1933, we had less of a role of the federal government and less absolutely needed, much more stress in the states. Now we go to a more, well, significant role of the federal government. Since 1964, federalism has taken on different forms, and it's an interpretation on what the role of the federal government is. Let's look at the role of creative federalism, basically the Johnson administration, which had a lot of grants and aid. We had a great expansion in the country regarding money that was spent, especially to fight poverty, crime, help the health care for the poor, help education. I mean, Head Start starts out of this. The vehicle for this was the federal grant and aid. About 200 grants were put in during the 5 years of Johnson's presidency. And Johnson's policy of vast government spending bypassed the states in distributing the funds directly to the cities and counties, thus angering the states. When Richard Nixon came along in 1969, he changed it and called it the New Federalism, tried to return some power back to the states, tried to shrink the government size, although not successful. He did something different, and eventually Reagan changed this as well by shrinking it even further. What they used, though, is this idea of general revenue sharing. It's when funds without strings are attached to the states. The creative federalism of Johnson had strings attached to the states. What states want is more money, less strings. It's pretty much a given. Most of us would agree on that. The Reagan Revolution was another thing that really focused on devolving. In fact, Ronald Reagan, in his inaugural address, said that the problem with the government itself is the size of the government. With that being said, the Clinton administration took over in 1992, and they changed a few things, but the Republican majority that came into the House, led by Newt Gingrich, looked at the size of the government, the contract with America, and said we need to devolve powers back to the state. The federal government has gotten too large. And with the role of the National Governors Association and having President Clinton at the time being a former governor, they were able to successfully work on what should be sent back to the states and what should be left to the federal government. The question, though, is here. Who can provide services the most efficiently? And look at the impact of the USA Patriot Act since 2001. Local police have been forced to do the federal government's job. The raid at Postville, Iowa, saw a lot of local county sheriffs, state highway patrolmen doing the jobs that the INS and immigration and homeland security are supposed to do. At what point should we devolve to the point where the states have all the power and the federal government has none? It's a matter of centralization versus decentralization, and that's the main argument of federalism. Who controls what, when, and how? Is it the national or the states? And bottom line, if the national does it have strings? If the states give to the locals, does it have strings? How much should be devolved?